Hi, my name is Charissa McLeod. I'm an MPH student at the School of Global Public Health. This is a presentation for my Global Environmental Health class in the fall of 2020. Wittenoom, the town that got it wrong. The purpose of this presentation is to show the devastating effects that can occur at an asbestos mining company when safety is overlooked. First, we'll discuss a little bit of background about what is asbestos and why it's dangerous. Then we'll go into the mining process, and then we'll go over the company timeline. And after that, we'll discuss some of the outcomes that occurred because this company was in operations, and then we'll go through a summary, and I'll show you some of the resources that I used for research. So the asbestos in Wittenoom was crocidolite. This is a blue asbestos. It's a mineral fiber. It's found in soil and rock. In the picture in the center, you can compare about 20,000 asbestos fibers to a few grains of salt. Asbestos was known for its strength and making it a desirable construction material. It was also known to be flame resistant and used often in insulation. So one of the managers questioned a doctor that came to visit the mine in Wittenoom. Here was his quote, "All the fuss is just a bunch of bull dust." Let's find out more if this is accurate. So even before the mine broke ground, asbestos was known to be a carcinogen. One of the reasons that makes it so dangerous is because the fibers are so small, it becomes airborne. And our respiratory system is one of our systems that is exposed to the external environment. So when we inhale these particles. So when these particles are inhaled, the fighter cells in our body cannot completely engulf them, and they induce a controlled cell death that stimulates inflammation. Some of the diseases that you'll see associated with asbestos around the world is shown here in this graph. Lung cancer being the most prevalent, although there's also mesothelioma, ovarian cancer, throat cancer, and asbestosis. In the picture on the left, under a microscope, the blue is the infected area. So this graph shows the amount of asbestos imports that occurred and the amounts of deaths that occurred related to asbestos disease. So here we see that asbestos is dangerous even when imported and not just in the mining setting. 80% of the people that lived in Wittenoom died of asbestos-related diseases. This is extremely sad because this is a completely preventable disease had exposure not occurred. The other 20% died of natural causes. So let's discuss Wittenoom a little bit more. Wittenoom is a death trap, quoted by President of the Asbestos Disease Society of Western Australia. So Wittenoom is located north of Perth in Western Australia. It is about a 12-hour drive in the middle of nowhere to get to Wittenoom. It is known to be the largest contaminated site in the southern hemisphere. So now let's learn about the mining process. So mining began in a shaft. Often these are small, closed corridors. And then it would be moved to the factory where it would later be crushed. So the rock starts out looking a little bit like this. And then we see the employees here putting it into the machines to crush further the asbestos. In some factories, the asbestos would be dampened, but the quality of water and the water supply in Wittenoom being so far isolated from the rest of the area that they did not dampen the asbestos in Wittenoom. As well, international standards, when exported, didn't really like when the asbestos was wet. So then the asbestos now looks a little bit something like this. Then the asbestos is ready for transportation and gets put into these Hessen bags. Because asbestos is so tiny, they would often seep through the material of these bags and then further transfer it to the community. Once transported, it would go to various construction sites, which we will discuss a little bit later. The mining company in Wittenoom mined approximately 160,000 tons of asbestos. Now, to put that into perspective, this is approximately the weight of 6.5 Statues of Liberty, or about the weight of 12 Brooklyn bridges. So now, where does the asbestos go next? Many of us might have heard about taking precautions when doing renovations on your house, to beware of when your house was built, to know if to not disturb the asbestos and have a safe removal, to not expose yourself to this dangerous product. Here is a graph of the most where asbestos was consumed in each product group. So the biggest group being cement water pipes. So these are typically the pipes that are underground. There's also cement sheeting, both in residential and commercial, and roofing, flooring, and friction products. So that's the mining process. So now let's go into the company timeline. So the company broke ground in 1943. Already there had been known that asbestos was dangerous before this time, and claims were even made in some countries against asbestos and their employers. Also in 1943, a report on the asbestos mill owned and operated by the subsidiary of the company same company that was owned in Wittenoom, says that asbestos dust is a health hazard and discusses methods of eliminating it. The company carried on, though. First warnings occurred only a year after it opened. 2 years after the warnings, first case of asbestos-related disease from a Wittenoom employee was determined. At this time, the inspector at the Wittenoom mine said the conditions of dust were terrific. This was not the case. The warnings continued in 1948, and an exposure limit was set for Australia in 1951. So this limit was 176 particles per cubic centimeter. The mine at Wittenoom was often 6 to 8 times over the safe levels, although now we know that there is no safe level of asbestos. And 10 years later, that limit was reduced by 97%, and then later reduced altogether to 0. So in 1965, 20 years after the mine opened, locals were warned by the local council about the dangers of asbestos in the community. The plant later closed in 1966, not for safety reasons, more for financial and economic reasons. During this time period, Australia had the highest record incidence of mesothelioma in the world because during this time, Australia was the highest user of asbestos-based products. The local market was dominated by this firm in Wittenoom. So now let's go into the outcomes and what happened after the closure of the mine. So in 1967, blue asbestos was banned in Australia. Today, parts of the world have bans and restrictions on asbestos, although there are many countries that don't. As you can see, the United States is one of them. So as we saw in the time frame, there were warnings, although these warnings, nobody did anything about them. This because the public health department didn't have much authority over what mines could do and how fines would be in place if they didn't meet these restrictions. So throughout, after the mine closed, these systems were set in place and asbestos societies to prevent the diseases were set up and different public health policies, like the requirement for ventilation and meeting these exposure limits. So in 1988, the first victory in court happened amongst the survivors. So 20 million would be paid to the 100 survivors who worked at Wittenoom up to 1958, with $30 million to those who worked thereafter. In 2006, the power was turned off to Wittenoom altogether, including water supply and other utilities for the city. In 2007, it was removed altogether from the maps in Australia and designated a contaminated site. Now it's argued that should Wittenoom still be on Google Earth if it was removed from the maps? Today, there is one person living in Wittenoom. And despite being removed from the map, many individuals have taken to Wittenoom as a form of extreme tourism. So what did we learn from Wittenoom's story? That maybe we should listen to warnings. We should take safety seriously, and the proper protection and equipment needed for a project or a company isn't just there to create extra costs, it's there for the protection of the people. Asbestos is dangerous, and policy intervention is required for change to happen. As we saw, the mine was able to run and continue operations for so many years, although asbestos was already known to be dangerous. So although progress is important, it's important that we don't turn a blind eye to safety. Now here are some of the resources that I used for my presentation. There are actually some interesting documentaries on YouTube you can find. The Safety Institute was one of the ones that I watched a few times and found very fascinating. People also kind of say this is like the Chernobyl of Australia. I want to thank you again for listening to my presentation. My name is Sharissa McLeod, and should you wish to ask me any questions, follow up, or discuss more, here are some ways you can find me.